He slapped me in front of his mom, and it brought his whole world crashing down. For 4 years, my life with Adrian Keller was a masterclass in walking on eggshells. I had become an expert in interpreting the subtle shifts in the atmosphere of our home, the tightening of his jaw, the specific way he'd set down his keys on the hall table. These were the barometers of my safety, the storm warnings I learned to read with the panicked precision of a sailor scanning the horizon. The abuse had started small, insidiously so almost easy to explain away. A quick, stinging backhand if his dinner was a few minutes late or not hot enough. A hard shove against the wall if I disagreed with him about something as trivial as which movie to watch. It was always, without fail, behind closed doors. It was always followed by a flood of remorse, of passionate, tearful apologies and desperate promises that it would never, ever happen again. He'd hold me, his hands so gentle after being so cruel, and whisper about the stress from his law firm, the pressure he was under, how he didn't know his own strength. And like a fool, blinded by the man I thought I had married, I believed him every single time. I absorbed his excuses and made them my own, a shield against the terrifying truth. His mother, Eleanor Whitmore, was visiting for the weekend, which meant my baseline anxiety, already a constant hum beneath the surface of my life, was cranked up to a shrieking 11. I had spent the entire week in a flurry of frantic activity, trying to transform myself and our home into a flawless reflection of the life she believed her son deserved. Eleanor was everything I wasn't. She was polished, educated, and descended from one of the small southern town's founding families, a fact she never missed an opportunity to subtly mention. She moved with an easy, inherited grace that made me feel clumsy and loud in my own skin. From the moment Adrian had introduced us, she had made it painfully, unequivocally clear that I, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks with a community college education and a job at a bookstore, was not good enough for her precious son. In her eyes, I was the calculating opportunist who had trapped him in an unwanted pregnancy. A pregnancy we tragically lost just 4 months into our marriage, a heartbreaking event she somehow managed to frame as yet another one of my personal failings. I remember her visiting me in the hospital, her expression not one of sympathy, but of cool assessment. "Well," she'd said, straightening the blanket on my bed with a crisp snap, "perhaps it's for the best. It's important to build a strong foundation for a marriage before bringing children into the mix." There was no comfort, only a chillingly practical dismissal of my grief. Eleanor had this incredible, infuriating talent for making me feel like a bug under a microscope without ever saying anything overtly cruel. She was a master of the backhanded compliment, the subtle dig wrapped in a veneer of polite concern. She'd run a single, perfectly manicured finger along a dusty bookshelf and say, "Oh, dear, this old house does get so dusty, doesn't it? I know a wonderful cleaning service if you're feeling overwhelmed." She'd taste a dish I'd spent hours on and remark, "This is lovely, dear." It reminds me of that little bistro Adrian used to take his ex-girlfriend, Tiffany, to. You remember Tiffany, Adrian? Such a fantastic cook, and from such a lovely, stable family. Every conversation was a minefield, a test of my worthiness, and in her eyes, I always failed. That weekend, I was determined to get it right. I pulled out all the stops, turning myself into a domestic goddess. I made all of her favorite dishes, consulting a notebook where I'd secretly jotted down her preferences over the years. Cucumber sandwiches with the crusts meticulously sliced off with a serrated knife, Earl Grey tea steeped for exactly 4 minutes and served with a sliver of lemon, and a beef Wellington that took me 6 agonizing hours and 3 YouTube tutorials to get just right. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, vacuuming carpets that were already spotless and polishing silver that already gleamed until my own exhausted reflection stared back at me. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood as she offered a running commentary of little criticisms about everything. From my choice of flowers for the guest room, "Lilies are lovely, dear, but a bit funereal for a bedroom, don't you think?" to the brand of coffee I served, "A bit acidic for my palate, but I'm sure it's fine." She had this way of looking at me, a sort of detached disappointment, as if I were a stain on her beautiful family portrait that she just had to tolerate for the sake of her son. Her disapproval was a palpable presence, a cold draft that followed her into every room. The explosion, when it finally came, was over something so ridiculously, infuriatingly small. It was the china. In my frenzy of perfectionism, I had accidentally used the good china for lunch instead of saving it for the dinner party we were hosting for some of Adrian's law partners that night. It was an honest mistake. I was so nervous about impressing her, my hands were literally shaking as I set the table, and I just grabbed the wrong stack of plates from the high cabinet. It was Adrian's grandmother's priceless Haviland china, with delicate little hand-painted blue flowers winding around the rim. Each plate, as Adrian had once informed me, was worth more than I made in a week at the bookstore. The second Adrian laid eyes on the table, I saw his face go from pleasantly flushed from the lunchtime wine to a deep, mottled beet red. I saw the vein in his temple, the one I'd come to think of as his rageometer, start to throb with a sickening, familiar rhythm. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous, a tone that was for my ears only, a tone that made my stomach clench and my blood run cold. "I specifically told you, those are for tonight when the Langfords are here. Those plates are worth more than you make in a single month. Do you have any idea how fragile they are?" "I'm sorry," I whispered, my own face burning with shame. My hands trembled as I reached to clear the plates, my primary focus shifting from his anger to the terrifying possibility of dropping one of the precious heirlooms. "I'll wash them by hand immediately and reset everything with the everyday dishes. I'll be more careful, I promise." His mother just sat there, a pillar of serene composure, sipping her tea from one of the lovely, fragile cups, her expression completely placid. Her perfectly applied crimson lipstick didn't even leave a mark on the rim. She was a statue. I was desperately, foolishly hoping her presence would act as a shield, a social deterrent. Surely, he wouldn't dare show his true, monstrous colors in front of the one person whose opinion mattered more to him than anything else in the world. I had never been more catastrophically wrong in my entire life. Adrian's hand shot out across the table and clamped around my wrist. His grip wasn't just firm, it was crushing. I felt the small, delicate bones of my wrist grind together as his fingers wrapped entirely around my arm. "You never listen, do you?" he snarled, his face just inches from mine now, his breath hot and sour with wine. "You're too stupid to follow one simple instruction. How many times do I have to explain things before they manage to penetrate that thick skull of yours?" The usual, suffocating panic rose in my chest like a tidal wave. This was the script. This was how it always started. The carefully chosen insults designed to strip away my confidence and make me feel worthless, the vice-like grip that would leave a perfect, ugly set of purple fingerprints on my arm for days, and the quiet, insidious way he had of making me believe that every single thing that went wrong in his life was somehow, fundamentally, my fault. I tried to pull away, a weak, reflexive gesture, but he just squeezed harder, bringing hot, involuntary tears to my eyes. "Please," I whimpered, my eyes darting nervously to his mother, sending a desperate, silent plea for intervention. "Adrian, you're hurting me." Eleanor continued to sip her tea. She raised an eyebrow slightly, her face as blank as a porcelain doll's, as if she were watching a mildly interesting, if somewhat poorly acted, television program. No help was coming from her. Of course not. She would probably just blame me for provoking him, for embarrassing her perfect son during her visit, for being the kind of inadequate, hysterical woman who drove good men to violence through her own incompetence. And that's when he did it. Right there, in the middle of their pristine, sun-drenched dining room, with its crystal chandelier and a mahogany table that had been passed down through generations of Kellers. Right in front of his mother. He drew his hand back and slapped me across the face. The force of it was shocking, so much harder than ever before. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and I tasted the coppery, metallic tang of blood in my mouth. The impact sent me stumbling backward, my body colliding hard with an antique sideboard. My hip cracked against the sharp, carved edge, and a jolt of pain shot up my side. A crystal vase filled with the lilies she had criticized wobbled precariously, and I instinctively shot out my free hand to steady it, a ridiculous, ingrained reflex to protect an inanimate object of value while my own body was under attack. I stood there, stunned and shaking, my cheek burning as if it had been branded with a hot iron, and I waited. I waited for Eleanor to gasp, to object, to do something, anything. She was always so obsessed with appearances, with social decorum. Surely, this crossed a line. Instead, she set her teacup down on its saucer with a delicate, deliberate, and deafeningly loud clink. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden, ringing silence of the room like a bell tolling the end of an era. "Adrian James Keller," she said, her voice piercing the tension like a shard of glass. "What did you just do?" Something in her tone, a frigid, deadly calm, made Adrian freeze instantly, his hand still half raised from the slap. It wasn't the voice of a shocked mother or a concerned mother-in-law. There was no surprise, no terror, no dismay in her voice at all. It was something else entirely. It was the cold, flat weight of absolute authority. It was the voice she must have used when he was a small, misbehaving child who had just tracked mud across her spotless white carpets. It was the voice of inevitable and unpleasant consequences. He started to stammer, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, trying to form an excuse, but she raised one perfectly manicured finger, a small but powerful gesture that silenced him instantly, as if she were a conductor demanding a sudden caesura from her orchestra. "I asked you a question," she repeated, her tone chillingly calm and devoid of any emotion. "What did you just do to your wife?" Adrian's face cycled through a bizarre kaleidoscope of colors, from ghost white to furious red and back again. I could see the gears turning frantically in his head as he searched for a way to spin this, a way to blame me, a way to convince his mother that not only was his action justified, but that I deserved it. She was being disrespectful, Mom, he finally mumbled, his voice shaky and weak, sounding more like a petulant teenager than a 35-year-old man. She needs to learn. She's so careless. She never thinks before she acts. She's always making mistakes. His mother rose slowly and gracefully from her chair, the sound of it scraping against the polished hardwood floor echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She was a small woman, barely 5'4" in her sensible heels, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over him, to fill the entire space with an intimidating, palpable presence. The look on her face was one I'd never seen before in the 4 years I had known her. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, harder, and far more menacing. It was a look of deliberate, predatory focus that made Adrian, my big, intimidating, abusive husband, take an involuntary step backward until his back hit the wall. "Sit down," she commanded. And to my utter, slack-jawed astonishment, he did. He sank back into his chair like a scolded child whose strings had just been cut. Eleanor walked over to me, her heels clicking against the floor with the crisp precision of a soldier on parade. For a terrifying second, I thought she was going to hit me, too, to finish what her son had started, to punish me for embarrassing her family. Instead, she gently took my chin in her hand, her touch surprisingly soft and cool, and tilted my face toward the light streaming in from the bay window. The red, swollen handprint was already beginning to darken into an ugly bruise that would paint my cheek for weeks. My lip was split and bleeding where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. "How long?" she asked, her voice quiet and even, her piercing eyes locked on my face. I was completely bewildered by her sudden, inexplicable kindness. I don't understand," I mumbled. "How long has my son been hitting you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating like smoke from a house fire. I could feel Adrian's eyes burning into me from across the table, a silent, screaming threat of what would happen later, when we were alone, if I dared to tell the truth. The old, familiar, paralyzing fear that had kept me silent for 4 long years wrapped itself around my throat like a vine. "He doesn't," I started, the lies tumbling out automatically, a well-rehearsed script. "It was just an accident, I tripped." "Don't lie to me," she cut in, her voice still quiet but now lined with unbendable steel. "I am many things, but I am not a fool. I've been watching you for 4 years. I know what fear looks like on a woman's face. I know what the careful, deliberate motions of someone trying to be invisible look like. I know what a forced, brittle smile looks like, and I know what it means when someone flinches every time a door slams or a voice is raised." She turned her glacial gaze back on Adrian, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "4 years ago, you came back from your honeymoon with a black eye. You told me you walked into a door on the cruise ship. I knew you were lying. At the time, I thought she had hit you. And a part of me, a dark part I'm not proud of, was almost glad that you'd finally married someone with enough of a spine to fight back." Adrian's jaw dropped. The narrative he'd so carefully constructed for his mother was crumbling before his eyes. "Mom," she said, her voice gaining strength with each syllable, like a storm gathering force, "I raised you better than this. I raised you to be a man of honor, not a coward who terrorizes women. Your father. God knows your father had his flaws. He was a difficult man, but he was not a coward who hit women." That wasn't entirely true. I'd heard the hushed family stories from Adrian's sister about their father's terrifying rages, about holes punched in walls, and his mother's convenient summer long sleeves that hid bruises. But Eleanor was rewriting history for a purpose, and I was beginning to understand what it was. She walked calmly to her expensive leather purse, pulled out her sleek, new model phone, and I saw a flicker of real, primal terror in Adrian's eyes for the very first time since I'd known him. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm calling your sister, Beatrice," she said calmly, her thumb hovering over the screen. "And then I'm calling the police." The room went dead silent, except for the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Adrian shot up from his chair so fast it clattered to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. "You can't do that," he snarled, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "This is a private matter. This is between me and my wife. You have no right to interfere." Eleanor looked at him with a level of loathing I'd only ever seen directed at me. "Everything you do is my business when you do it in this house, under this roof, and in my family's name," she said coldly. I did not spend 35 years of my life meticulously building this family's reputation in this town, serving on charity boards and hosting fundraisers and being a pillar of this community, just to have you destroy it all by beating your wife like some common, white trash thug. And there it was, the confirmation.
It wasn't about me.
It wasn't about compassion or moral outrage, or a noble desire to protect the innocent. It was about appearances. It was about protecting the precious, carefully cultivated image of the Keller family. But in that moment, for the first time in 4 long, lonely years, someone was standing between me and Adrian's fists, and I didn't give a damn what her reasons were. He tried to reason with her, his voice shifting into the smooth, logical, patronizing tone he always used to manipulate me after an attack. "Mom, you don't understand the whole situation," he began, spreading his hands in a gesture of phony reasonableness. "She provokes me. She knows exactly which buttons to push to get me upset. She does things on purpose to get a reaction. She isn't as innocent as she looks." Eleanor held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I've heard that excuse before," she said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of sympathy. "I heard it from your father when he tried to explain why he'd punched a hole through the kitchen wall. I've heard it from every weak, pathetic man who believes that his own emotions are someone else's responsibility. I've heard it from every coward who blames his victim for his own lack of self-control." She turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her eyes held something that looked almost like maternal warmth, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my own mother had died when I was 16. "Pack a bag," she said gently. "You're coming home with me." The brainwashing, the years of conditioning, kicked in instantly. "I can't," I said automatically, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "The Langfords are coming for dinner at 7. I have to finish the roast. I haven't even made the dessert yet." "The Langfords can order a pizza," she snapped, her voice impervious to any debate. "Adrian needs to learn that his actions have consequences. And you," she said, her gaze softening slightly, "you need to learn that you are a human being who deserves dignity and respect, not a servant, a punching bag, or a piece of property." Adrian lunged forward, his face twisting back into that familiar mask of pure rage. "She's not going anywhere," he growled, his voice dropping into the low, menacing register that had haunted my nightmares for 4 years. "She's my wife. We made vows. For better or for worse." Eleanor actually smiled then, and it was the most chilling, predatory expression I had ever seen. "Actually," she said, pulling a thick, bulging manila folder from her handbag like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, "she's about to be your ex-wife." She spread the contents across the gleaming mahogany dining room table. It was 4 years of my life, my secret, shameful life, documented in horrifying, undeniable detail. There were photographs of me at family gatherings with bruises on my arms and legs that I had tried so desperately to hide with makeup and long sleeves. A grainy but clear photo from Christmas 2 years prior where you could see the distinct, finger-shaped bruises on my upper arm, captured by the camera's flash. A shot from an Easter brunch, where the split lip I'd blamed on tripping over the cat was undeniable. "How did you get these?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, staring at the documented evidence of my own secret pain. "I hired a private investigator 3 years ago," she said, her voice as calm and matter-of-fact as if she were talking about hiring a gardener. "A very discreet man who specializes in domestic situations. I suspected something was wrong, but I needed concrete, irrefutable proof. I couldn't act on a gut feeling. Not with something this serious." The folder was a Pandora's box of my misery. There were medical records from the urgent care clinic where I'd gotten stitches after Adrian had accidentally pushed me into the sharp corner of our glass coffee table during an argument about his gambling losses. There were bank statements showing how my meager paychecks from the bookstore were being deposited directly into an account controlled solely by Adrian, leaving me with no access to my own money. There were phone records of my calls to my sister, calls that were always mysteriously cut short whenever Adrian came home early from work. And then there were the photos taken with telephoto lenses through our living room windows, showing Adrian grabbing me, shouting in my face, backing me into a corner with his fist raised. And most chillingly, there were audio recordings of our fights, captured by some long-range microphone I had no idea existed. The investigator had even interviewed our neighbors, who admitted under the promise of anonymity that they had often heard screaming and crashing sounds through our thin walls, but had never called the police because they didn't want to get involved in a private matter. Adrian, his face a mask of pure desperation, made a frantic grab for the photos, but Eleanor was faster. She scooped them up, clutching the folder to her chest like a shield. "You are a pathetic excuse for a man," she spat at her son, her voice dripping with a level of pure scorn I had never heard from a human being. "You are worse than your father ever was. At least he had the excuse of a miserable, impoverished childhood. You had every advantage in the world, a fine education, money, endless opportunities, and this is what you chose to do with it." And then Adrian's mask of civilized behavior, the one he had so carefully worn in front of his mother his entire life, finally shattered into a million pieces. He lunged at her, his face twisted with the same homicidal rage I had seen directed at me so many times before, his hand raised to strike the woman who had given birth to him. But Eleanor Whitmore, it turned out, was a survivor. She had survived 42 years of marriage to a difficult, volatile man, and she had learned how to protect herself. She sidestepped him with a surprising, fluid agility for a woman in her mid-60s and drove her knee up, hard, between his legs. Adrian crumpled to the floor like a sack of rocks, gasping and clutching himself, making guttural, wounded animal sounds on the beautiful Persian rug his grandmother had brought back from a trip abroad. Eleanor calmly straightened her skirt, stepped over her writhing, whimpering son as if he were a piece of trash in her path, and picked up her phone. "Now," she said to the 911 operator, her voice perfectly composed, "I'm definitely calling the police." The next few hours were a surreal blur of flashing blue and red lights, of uniformed officers and hushed, serious conversations that seemed completely out of place in our quiet, perfect-looking neighborhood. Detective Lucia Ferraro, a compassionate, dark-eyed woman who had clearly seen this all 1,000 times before, asked me a series of gentle but probing questions. How often did he hit you? Did he ever threaten to kill you? Have you ever feared for your life? Did he control your access to money or communication with friends and family? The answers spilled out of me, a torrent of suppressed pain and fear, revealing a pattern of systematic, calculated abuse that had gone completely undetected by everyone except the private investigator Eleanor had so methodically hired. Yes, he controlled all of our finances. Yes, he had slowly, skillfully persuaded me to cut ties with friends he deemed a bad influence. Yes, he checked my phone and email on a daily basis. And yes, more times than I could count, I had been terrified that he might actually kill me during his most violent outbursts. Eleanor held my hand through the entire, harrowing process, her grip cool and steady, an anchor in the storm of my trauma. Adrian was arrested for felony domestic violence and led away in handcuffs, shouting threats and obscenities from the back of the police car as the neighbors gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns to witness the spectacular downfall of the golden boy of the country club set. Later that night, sitting in Eleanor's immaculate, cream-colored living room, surrounded by meticulously arranged fresh flowers, I finally voiced the question that had been burning in my mind since she had stood up to her own son. "Why now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "If you knew what was happening, if you'd been documenting it for 3 long years, why didn't you help me before? Why did you let it go on for so long?" She was silent for a long time, staring out the window at her immaculately manicured garden, where every flower bloomed in its proper, designated place. Then she reached into an ancient, inlaid jewelry box on the side table and drew out an old, faded photograph, its edges softened by years of handling. The photograph depicted a young woman with dark, kind eyes, smiling at the camera with the kind of radiant, unclouded joy that only comes with true happiness and a hopeful heart. She was dressed in a beautiful lace wedding gown. "This is my sister, Isabel Whitmore," Eleanor said quietly, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, vulnerable in a way that made her seem, for the first time, truly human. "She died when she was 28. Her husband, a man everyone thought was a charming, successful pillar of his community, beat her to death with a tire iron in their garage while their 2 small children slept upstairs in their beds." I stared at the photo, my heart racing and my mouth dry. I had never known Adrian even had an aunt. "I was supposed to be her maid of honor," Eleanor continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph with the infinite gentleness of someone handling something sacred and broken. "Instead, I was a pallbearer at her funeral 6 years later. I swore that day, standing beside her open grave in the pouring rain, that I would never again let another woman in my family suffer what she suffered. I would never again fail to act when I saw the signs. But you never liked me," I said, still trying to reconcile the cold, critical woman I had known with the avenging angel sitting before me. "You always made it clear I wasn't good enough for Adrian. You criticized everything I did." Eleanor sighed, a deep, weary sound, and for the first time, she looked all of her 66 years. "I was trying to protect you in the only way I knew how," she confessed, her voice heavy with regret. "I thought if I could convince you to leave him on your own, if I could make you see that this family, that this life, wasn't right for you, you'd be safer. I was trying to drive you away. When that didn't work, when I saw that you were just like Isabel, too loyal, too hopeful, too willing to believe that love could fix a broken man, I knew I had to take a different, more drastic approach." She opened a second folder, this one even thicker than the first, filled with legal paperwork and correspondence. "I needed enough concrete, undeniable proof to ensure that Adrian would go to prison, not just get a slap on the wrist and court-ordered anger management classes that never change anything. I needed a case so airtight that he could never hurt you, or any other woman, ever again. If I'd acted too early, with insufficient evidence, he would have just learned to be more careful, more secretive. He would have isolated you completely, and the next time might have been the last time." The divorce proceedings and the criminal trial were a 10-month-long nightmare, but Eleanor was there every single step of the way. She hired the best, most ruthless family law attorney money could buy, a small, fierce woman named Clara Voss who specialized in high-conflict domestic violence cases and had a reputation for eviscerating abusive men in the courtroom. Adrian's expensive team of lawyers tried to portray me as an incompetent, manipulative, and mentally unstable gold digger who had driven their client to violence through my own failures. But their case was completely shattered by the sheer weight of Eleanor's evidence. The photographs, the medical records, the private investigator's damning testimony, and the audio recordings that revealed Adrian's true nature in ways that no amount of expensive legal maneuvering could ever overcome. During one particularly traumatic session, Clara Voss played a recording of Adrian screaming at me, threatening to kill me if I ever tried to leave him, his voice crystal clear and unmistakable. The judge, a woman, went white as a sheet as she listened, and I saw her hands clench into tight fists under the bench. Adrian received a 6-year state prison sentence for aggravated domestic abuse, with a possibility of parole after 4 years, contingent on him undergoing substantial psychological counseling. The judge made it clear that any future infractions would result in a much longer sentence. In the divorce settlement, I received the house, a hefty alimony to help me rebuild my life, and a permanent restraining order that would follow him for the rest of his days. Eleanor and I never became close friends in the traditional sense. Our history was too complicated, too fraught with pain for that. But we developed a complex, unspoken relationship based on mutual respect and a shared, tragic trauma. She helped me find a job at her charitable foundation, working with other women who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping abusive relationships. In turn, I think I helped her process some of the guilt she'd carried for 42 long years over her sister's death, her failure to recognize the warning signs in time to save her. On the day Adrian was sentenced, Eleanor waited for me on the courthouse steps. As we watched him being led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with impotent rage, shouting promises of vengeance that echoed off the cold stone walls, she turned to me and said something I will never forget. "Isabel would have liked you," she said quietly, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "You're stronger than either of us gave you credit for." 8 months later, I began volunteering at a women's shelter 3 towns over. I used my story to help other women recognize the signs of abuse that I had overlooked or rationalized for so long. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I met Julian Morrow, a counselor who worked at the shelter, running programs for male batterers, trying to break the cycle of violence. He understood trauma and recovery in ways that most people couldn't. He was patient with my lingering fears, my startled responses, the way I still trembled when a man moved too swiftly near me. He never made me feel damaged or broken. When he asked me to marry him after 3 years of patient, gentle courtship, Eleanor was the first person I called. "You're sure about this one?" she asked, her voice heavy with the weight of our shared experience. "I'm sure," I replied, surprised by my own certainty. "He makes me feel safe." At our small, intimate wedding, held in the garden of the women's shelter, I wore Isabel's beautiful pearl necklace, which Eleanor had offered me as something borrowed, something old. As she fastened the tiny, delicate clasp around my neck, her fingers trembling slightly, she whispered, "She would have wanted you to have this. She would have wanted you to find happiness after surviving what you survived." Adrian was released from prison that same year. Within a month, he had violated his restraining order twice, once by showing up at the bookstore where I used to work, and once by accidentally following me at the grocery store. He didn't fool the judge this time. He was sentenced to another 3 years in prison. "Some dragons," Eleanor observed dryly over the phone, "never stop breathing fire." Julian and I have been married for 8 years now. We have 4 children who will grow up knowing that they deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. Eleanor is Grandma Ellie to them, a doting, adoring grandmother who teaches them about art and tells them carefully edited stories about their brave mother who escaped from a dragon and found a prince who treated her with kindness. The dragon, she never tells them, was her own son. Last month, Eleanor called with news. Adrian had been arrested again, this time for assaulting his new, 24-year-old girlfriend. I have volunteered to testify at his trial about the pattern of abuse. Some dragons never change. But sometimes, if we're very, very lucky and very, very brave, we find someone willing to stand between us and the flames. Sometimes that person comes from the most unlikely place imaginable. Sometimes, salvation looks like a slap heard around the world, witnessed by the one right person who refuses, finally, to let it go unanswered.